In today's video, I discuss one of the most influential and impactful fantasy role-playing series of all time. I am of course talking about Quest 64. This game actually made me cry with its difficulty, and I wish I was kidding. Instead, let's discuss every mainline Elder Scrolls game excluding the weird spin-offs and mobile games and rank them worst to best. And as always, if you find yourself enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe and let us begin.
Hey, you're finally awake.
Number 5, The Elder Scrolls Arena. The one to start our list is the one that started it all, and when you see Arena now, a full 30 years after its release, it's hard to look past just the sheer age of this classic RPG. Now, if this was solely ranking the cover art for the games, then Arena would be number 1 for reasons. Arena embraced many classic role-playing game elements as it tried to translate the dice rolling, grand sense of adventure, danger, and dungeon diving of classic tabletop games into a video game format. To this end, Arena used procedural generation in an attempt to capture the open-ended, sprawling, and seemingly endless world that tabletop gaming can capture in ways that video games just can't, especially ones in the early 90s. Initially planned to have a much narrower scope where players could play a customizable arena fighter who traveled from town to town battling in different arenas of combat until becoming champion, the game expanded and grew to include quests, more areas, and many more RPG elements. However, it kept the Arena name, which is kind of perplexing, but was apparently necessary because marketing materials had already been created for the game before this change in direction. Despite its appearance now, Arena was actually very innovative and cutting edge in some ways, and went on to win some industry awards and of course spawn an entire franchise of beloved games. The big innovation here was how it treated the open world, in that it had one at all, but which also featured dynamic elements such as a full day-night cycle and randomly placed events and locations. The world of Arena spanned the entirety of the continent of Tamriel, which sounds impressive until you remember that every single region is randomly generated and almost completely barren. It could also create some funny moments where a player could travel to one location through a desert to turn back and return through a dense forest on the same route. Despite the jank of this game, the sense of discovery and mystery, in addition to the established lore, the first-person perspective, and general gameplay elements have carried forward into almost every single entry in the series up until now, 30 years later. Unsurprisingly, the gameplay of Arena has not aged well at all, with behind-the-scenes dice rolling being the main factor in whether or not you can actually hit something with your sword, and mouse controls being almost non-existent for movement or navigation. Melee combat is extremely janky, requiring players to drag the mouse to imitate swinging a weapon instead of just simply clicking, and magic and spell targeting is very unintuitive and overcomplicated. Arena is also famously and punishingly difficult, as the designers seemingly fully embrace the dangers and difficulty of early tabletop gaming. It drops players right into the deep end, with arguably the hardest dungeon in the game being the starting one, and the scaling and power of the enemies within it only gets harder and harder the longer you stay in there. Successfully surviving and leaving the first dungeon in the game is a feat in and of itself. While Arena established so many well-known Elder Scrolls elements right out of the gate, it can be an incredibly difficult title to return to and enjoy. Not impossible, but the jank and age make it a real challenge to grapple with these gameplay systems after the 30 years of gameplay innovations and improvements since its release. So for that, it ranks last in my list. I'm sorry, ultra-sexualized and questionably armored warrior woman. Also, it would be criminal to talk about Arena and not mention its epic main theme. Number 4, The Elder Scrolls 2, Daggerfall. My list stays chronological for now, with the second worst Elder Scrolls game being the second game in the series. 2 years after the release of Arena, Bethesda launched The Elder Scrolls 2, Daggerfall, which unlike Arena was seemingly designed from the ground up as a full RPG and unfortunately featured a much less evocative cover. This more focused direction and the lessons learned from the previous game allowed Daggerfall to push all of the RPG elements to the forefront of the game's design systems. Many systems that would once again carry forward through the entire future of the franchise. While technically I think the world of Daggerfall is smaller than Arena's, Daggerfall still featured an absurdly massive world, once again using this procedural generation to create regions, towns, and content, with the intent being to capture a classic tabletop gaming world. Graphics were also improved from Arena, with Daggerfall using fully 3D environments mixed with 2D sprites for characters and items. I mean, just look at those improved graphics. Expanded character customization, an improved UI, expanded quests, guilds, religions that could be joined, with unique quest lines and character reputation systems, all of these were intended to immerse the player into the game's world and create the sense that this was an adventure with unlimited potential. Daggerfall was essentially the biggest game ever made on release. The idea that this was a truly open RPG that, while featured a primary plot and story, also allowed the player to really do whatever they want and be whatever they want, is arguably the most powerful value proposition of the entire series in my opinion. Daggerfall embraced this innovation and was rewarded for it, exploding in popularity and in many ways bringing Bethesda to the mainstream with its success. However, this direction had significant drawbacks in regards to the gameplay and story, unfortunately, with janky questlines that could easily be broken unintentionally, numerous broken items, character builds, interactions, and buggy gameplay systems. Daggerfall was in many ways a victim of its own innovation, as the vision of what this game could be far exceeded the capabilities of the software and technology at the time. In this though, I actually give Daggerfall credit, because while it was janky and had some broken features, it at least attempted to push the envelope forward in major ways. Bethesda showed ambition, even if they couldn't quite live up to it, and I personally enjoy seeing developers who try to revolutionize instead of simply iterate. Much like Arena, Daggerfall is another game that is really hard to enjoy today, at least for me, and unless you really want to experience this historical title and see the roots of the later games, then it's a difficult game to recommend playing now, despite the numerous innovative things it attempted. While Daggerfall did improve many things from Arena, it ultimately plays very similarly in the moment-to-moment gameplay, even bringing back the awkward mouse dragging to swing your sword in combat. I don't think it's quite as difficult as Arena, but this game is still insanely hard, especially when compared to later entries. Many people have very fond memories of Daggerfall, and for good reason. It's a great title that did some really awesome things. It's just ancient history where video games are concerned. Number 3, The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. Finally breaking my chronological order, the next game in this list as the third best mainline game is The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Just to be clear, everything after Arena I would consider really good in their own ways. However, while Oblivion was also innovative in some cool ways and also pushed the envelope, it once again suffers from some fairly big drawbacks that impact the gameplay negatively for me. That being said, I love this game. Released in 2005, only 9 years after Daggerfall, which is crazy considering we are already 13 years since the release of Skyrim, well, the original version. Oblivion vastly improved the graphics and presentation of the series. On release, Oblivion was frankly one of the best looking games ever made, especially in how realistically it rendered the newly added races present in the game. The Potato Head people were extremely well realized and an awesome addition to the lore. Character models aside, Oblivion is still a looker in many ways and holds up even today in my humble opinion. The graphics are emphasized by the relatively realistic and grounded look of its world. It's a fantasy world, of course, but maybe more than any other entry, one that is easily recognizable to anyone familiar with Western fantasy tropes. Large forests and lakes, meadows, and medieval cities, Oblivion, in some cases to a fault for me, embraced very classical fantasy design elements for its world and inhabitants. It takes place in the province of Cyrodiil, a much more limited scope compared to our previous two entries. However, where procedural generation technology was used to craft the world of Oblivion, unlike Arena and Daggerfall, it wasn't actively generating it as the player roamed around, creating a much more static, but well-realized, fleshed out, and richer gaming world. No longer would players roam endless barren fields generated by random variables on the fly. With Oblivion, Bethesda wanted more focus placed on the reactivity and realism of its world, and the importance and presentation of its story beats, both of which greatly modernized the series. Brand new features were developed to accomplish these goals: full NPC voice acting, dynamic range lighting, the integration of the Havoc physics engine, and of course the addition of what Bethesda called Radiant AI. Whereas previous entries featured named NPCs, they were all fairly static or only present in the game world itself when the player was nearby. Oblivion, however, presented an entire cast of living, fully scheduled characters. Every NPC in the game had their own set routine, personality, job, living space, and ability to react to events happening near them. While I honestly think this is incredibly cool tech for an RPG, it also presented some extremely difficult and unforeseen problems for the developers. Important characters wandering off or dying during their routines, or ending up in places they shouldn't be, or killing each other in hilarious but unrealistic chain reactions of violence as combat triggers triggered combat triggers. Radiant AI, while novel, ultimately hurt the game in a few ways, namely just the extremely low number of characters in general. While this is definitely a limitation of the Xbox 360 and PS3 hardware at the time, the world just feels kind of lifeless, with me struggling to believe that the capital city of this massive empire contains about 20 citizens. And more generally and broadly, the world of Oblivion to me was a great strength, but also a great weakness. Coming from the enrapturing and enticing alien world of Morrowind, in many ways Cyrodiil just felt too safe, too vanilla to truly capture the imagination. The Oblivion gates added some flavor. They were basically portals to hell that could appear in the world and opened up and spewed out demons. They're pretty awesome, but it doesn't take long to realize that the Oblivion side of these gates is extremely limited and underwhelming. The gates prove to be more of a nuisance as the game goes along instead of a full-scale invasion from basically hell. The actual moment-to-moment gameplay of Oblivion vastly improved what came before, with combat, while not perfectly fluid, feeling much more reactive and natural. New weapons, armors, and magic options made for a much more satisfying and visceral combat system, even if it still contained some jank. And range combat was surprisingly fun for me in this one, and spells were much easier to use and understand. However, as has been said many times before, the leveling and character progression systems of Oblivion presented some really big issues, with enemies scaling to the character's level, but not necessarily power. So if you built or invested points incorrectly, you could be facing level 40 bandits at level 40, however bandits that assumed you knew what you were doing when investing your points, not just randomly picking what sounded fun or cool. This made Oblivion for most people get much harder the more you progressed instead of easier or less challenging, and outside of following specific builds or using mods, it's a very difficult learning curve to get over. There was much more emphasis on the story of Oblivion, and Bethesda definitely tried to make it as epic and cinematic as they could, arguably to the detriment of other RPG systems in previous games. I think while ultimately higher production values like expensive voice actors and new tech helped to shape the game into a much more mainstream accessible experience, the trade-off in reduced and simplified RPG systems negatively impacted the game. That being said, Oblivion has some of my favorite guild quests and expansions in the series, so I can't fault it too much here. It's a fantastic game, but these potato people still live in my nightmares. Number 2, The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim. The second best Elder Scrolls for me is Skyrim. Absolutely the most mainstream and successful game in the series, Skyrim, despite its meme status and the fact that it's been released, like, what is it now, 15 times over 10 different platforms, is one of my favorite games of all time. In addition to its mainstream success, or probably as a result of it, Skyrim has actually garnered a significant amount of hatred and dismissal on online forums by longer-term fans of the series. And while many of the critiques of Skyrim's jank, bugginess, and reduction in full RPG systems are, they're pretty fair, this game for me is just so much greater than the sum of its parts. It may not have the most in-depth role-playing systems or quest design, it doesn't have the most in-depth or challenging combat, the world may not be fully reactive, but I just can't help but love jumping in and immersing myself in the setting and atmosphere of Skyrim. The soundtrack is just frankly one of the best ever made, with the music conveying such a wonderful sense of exploration and adventure. The general gameplay loop definitely has its faults, but simply being able to roam and get lost off the beaten path, exploring caverns, caves, dungeons, and new locations in a beautiful fantasy world is something that just cannot be denied. It's a personal preference, but I was drawn to the world of Skyrim in a way that I just wasn't with Oblivion. It felt more unique and immersive, with improved graphics, especially concerning character models. I could feel the stinging cold of the snowy peaks and the dankness of its dungeons. While even unreleased, the graphics weren't cutting edge compared to other games, the aesthetics and art direction of Skyrim make it one of the most immersive and atmospheric games I have ever played. While the game, in addition to pretty much every Elder Scrolls game, is vastly improved by the modding community and mods, the staying power and popularity of this game on consoles speaks to the strengths of its design. The gameplay of Skyrim was improved immensely from previous titles. While I wouldn't say it has amazing combat, it's smooth and polished enough to be completely enjoyable and engaging in its own right. The new dual-wielding system, where players could equip spells or weapons in either hand and use them simultaneously, greatly improved my personal favorite playstyle of a spell sword, at least before I inevitably descend into stealth archery. It retained much of the leveling and skill systems from Oblivion while streamlining some things to avoid the pitfalls of enemy scaling. Now, this was in a big way to the detriment of more in-depth RPG and character building systems, and it's not uncommon for a high-level Skyrim character being a master stealth, warrior, archer, mage, god. The high production values of Oblivion were retained as well, and in many ways even more streamlined for mass appeal. Full voice acting, more cinematic moments and scenes, cinematic finishing moves, all was intended to improve the presentation of the game as a full-fledged AAA experience. I will admit Skyrim's quest design and writing can be disappointing, but there are still quite a few quests I enjoy, and the expansions greatly enhanced the storytelling aspects in my opinion. The lack of world reactivity and engagement is definitely one of the more disappointing aspects of Skyrim, even when coming from Oblivion or Morrowind. While most NPCs in previous games had fairly canned and standard responses, there were still the options to ask them about rumors or places or people, and this relatively simple dialogue layer, even with its limitations, added a lot to the feeling of a living, breathing world outside of the player. Overall, I absolutely love journeying as the Dragonborn in Skyrim, and in many ways feel like it's the ultimate power fantasy. It's a game I find myself returning to again and again, especially in the fall for some reason. It's just my comfort go-to title. It's an amazing experience. Number 1, The Elder Scrolls III: Morrowind. However, as much as I enjoy Skyrim, it falls just slightly below my favorite entry in the Elder Scrolls series, the third game in the franchise, Morrowind. I openly admit I have a pretty significant nostalgic bias here, but even returning to Morrowind now, 22 years after its launch, I still enjoy the depth and breadth of its world, role-playing systems, and characters as much, if not more, than when it released. The strongest aspect of Morrowind for me is its world. It is a true fantasy world, almost alien in its design and presentation, and I love it for that. Taking place in the ashy, inhospitable region of Morrowind and learning about the Dunmer or Dark Elves and how they survive and thrive in this dangerous area is just so awesome, and that danger is communicated to the player very well as you explore the variety of regions within the world. While it obviously lacks the scope and polish and presentation of Skyrim or Oblivion, the world just has so much charm and uniqueness that help me look past these limitations. The intro in the beginning of the game is my favorite in the entire franchise, which is pretty funny when thinking about it. Oblivion attempts to start so mysteriously and intensely, with you escaping through the prison with the Emperor himself ambushed by assassins and fighting off monsters almost immediately. Skyrim's iconic opening goes for an epic, bombastic introduction to the main plot, with your execution interrupted by a full-scale dragon attack on the town, with chaos and fire raining from the sky. All of this emphasis on epic, intense moments pales in comparison to the start of Morrowind to me, which has you calmly walk off a boat onto a dock, with the game and NPCs almost literally saying, "Welcome to Morrowind, good luck," with nothing else but the common clothes on your back and a handful of gold. This is how every RPG should start, in my humble opinion. It's just such an understated and enticing introduction to this game. You pick your race, your class, or create your own, and you're off. Upon starting a new game, within 2 minutes, you are fully available to explore, discover, and begin developing your character as you see fit. Don't get me wrong, I love the epic vistas of leaving the prisons in Oblivion and Skyrim and finally seeing the world, but just simply walking onto this dock of this tiny outpost is incredibly engaging to me, as it feels like you just kind of wandered into this massive fantasy world. The lack of player handholding is another of Morrowind's greatest strengths, and in some cases a weakness. While it's much easier to understand where to go and who to talk to now, playing it as an adult who actually reads, playing when I was younger involved lots of random wandering and running away, with little to no idea of what I was doing or why, but I still loved it. Especially wandering into a house, murdering the people inside, and being told that I basically have doomed the world because I inadvertently killed someone critical to the main plot of the story. Speaking of NPCs, I still love the quest system of Morrowind in many ways. Randomly picking them up by just asking questions about people, learning more about quest locations or characters by asking others around town, feels so much more organic and richer to me than Skyrim's quest design in comparison. While the quests themselves are very simple, just the act of finding and resolving them feels so much like a classic role-playing game that trusted the player to be able to figure things out on their own instead of just being shown a map marker to follow. It's really not insanely complex, and in many cases is just a thin veneer of player agency, but compared to more modern titles it feels so immersive. Which leads me to the story and lore of Morrowind, which is just fantastic. The number of lore tidbits, books, and things to ask about and learn, it just makes it feel like such a well thought out and fleshed out fantasy world. The different gods and how the population is impacted by events feels super cool. It's like playing a D&D game with a DM who spent way too much time on the world building before the campaign kicked off. The main plot is also intriguing, and I enjoy the emphasis on player freedom on unraveling an ancient prophecy that involves major players in the world. It's not the most incredible story ever told, but it is very enjoyable to me. Morrowind's combat isn't great, and a weak point certainly, but not enough that it ruins the experience for me. Gone are the awkward dragging mouse movements of Daggerfall, and Arena and Magic has also been overhauled in this game. The ability to craft your character and your class and develop your skills also feels very rewarding, and the progression feels great. Also, Morrowind has spears. Every fantasy game needs spears. While returning to Morrowind now can feel challenging with its janky movement and combat, certain mods can help, and in my opinion, any fantasy or RPG fan should give this game a shot. Get immersed into the setting, take your time exploring its many secrets, and you'll have an awesome role-playing experience. Just prepare yourself to be ganked by these flying assholes. And there it is. While I didn't exactly rank every Elder Scrolls games, these to me are the ones really worth even discussing, as the spin-offs and mobile experiences aren't ones I have any interest in. That being said, Elder Scrolls Online is apparently very good and has only gotten better, but I'm not playing these games for multiplayer experience personally, so I've never tried it. Let me know your rankings in the comments below and tell me how wrong I am. Once again, I hope you enjoyed the video and make sure to subscribe for more. Until next time.